As I told you, we've been studying from the book of Joshua. So now we're turning the chapter, and we're now in chapter 2 of Joshua. And the text of the lesson is chapter 2, verse 1. Then Joshua secretly sent out 2 spies from the Israelite camp at Acacia Grove. He instructed them, scout out the land on the other side of the Jordan River, especially around Jericho. So the 2 men set out and came to the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there that night. I wanted to start out with a very interesting story I had read, and I don't know that you know this. There's a group called the Land Philharmonic, and it has its genesis in a little city called Cultura, which is on the outskirts of Asuncion in Paraguay, a different country. And they're actually making music with trash. And I thought that was just fascinating. You see, they're turning like wash tubs and pipes into like timpanis that you would play in an orchestra, and drain pipes that they are using now for trumpets. Other orchestras, they fine-tune their really highly polished maple cellos, and they're burnishing the brass on their tubas. But this band doesn't do any of that. They play Beethoven sonatas basically with plastic buckets. On their side of Asuncion, where they live, trash is really the only harvestable crop. And so people will go through the garbage dumps, picking and sorting and then selling the refuse for like pennies on the dollar. And many of them, the trash pickers themselves, have made the same fate as the trash that they're picking. They've been tossed out of society. They've been put on the garbage heap of a culture or of mankind and treated as refuse to be steered away by the other population. But now, thanks to 2 men, these people, especially children, are making music. Fabio Chavez is one of the individuals who came up with the Land Philharmonic. And he is an environmental technician who envisioned maybe a music school would help bring these kids to a better place and take them kind of out of the culture that they were in. And then there's Don Cola Gomez. He's a trash worker, and he's also a carpenter. Now, Mr. Gomez had never seen a violin, never heard a violin, never played a violin, never even touched one. And yet, when someone described what this instrument looked like, this man had the talent as an untutored craftsman to take a paint can and an oven tray and into his little tiny workshop and made a violin. So thanks to this Stradivarius, the junk pile gets a mulligan, and so do the kids who live among it. You see, God makes music out of riffraff. And Heaven's orchestra is composed of some of the most unlikely musicians you would have ever thought. For instance, Peter. Maybe he's playing first chair trumpet. But remember, Peter cursed the name of the very Christ who saved him. And then maybe there's Paul. Maybe he's a first chair violinist. And there was a day when, rather than playing the violin, he played the religious thug. And then the guy on the harp, that's King David. Yeah, that David, the womanizing David, the conniving David, the repentant David, the murderer David. And then today, I want you to pay particular attention to the woman in the orchestra who's playing the French horn. Her name is Rahab, and her story basically takes up most of the 2nd chapter of Joshua. And the background to Rahab's introduction is, as you would recall, time had come now for the Hebrew people to enter the promised land that God had given to them. It meant crossing the Jordan River. And as soon as you crossed the Jordan River, you came to a pretty formidable place called Jericho. This was a big town for its day, and it sat just north of the Dead Sea. And that was the Israelites' first challenge. And in this city of Jericho indwelled Canaanites. Now that doesn't sound like a scary person to me, but in today's probably culture, I guess you could think of a city that is completely filled with ISIS, okay? To give you an idea of what these people who had no idea how to fight a battle, I mean, they were former slaves in Egypt, now they're coming up against a town that is surrounded by a huge, huge wall and filled with nothing but ISIS fighters. That would be just a little intimidating. And to call the people in Jericho barbaric would be like you and I calling the North Pole just a little chilly. I mean, these people were barbarous. They turned temple worship into orgies. They burned babies alive as part of their sacrifice. The people of Jericho had absolutely no regard for human life at all or respect for God. And it was into this city now that these two spies of Joshua crept in. And it was in this city that these two spies met Rahab, the prostitute. And church, you know, a lot could be said about Rahab without having to mention her profession. For instance, she was a Canaanite. She provided cover for the spies of Joshua. She came to believe in the God of Abraham long before she ever actually met the children of Abraham. She was spared from the utter destruction of her city. She was grafted into the Hebrew culture. She married a contemporary of Joshua's. She bore a son named Boaz, had a great-grandson named Jesse, and a great-great-grandson named David. And Rahab had a descendant several generations later named Jesus. You see, Rahab's name appears on the family tree of the Son of God. Her resume didn't have to mention her profession. And yet, in 5 of the 8 appearances where Rahab shows up in the Bible, she's presented as a harlot. 5. I mean, wouldn't 1 be enough? I mean, and couldn't that 1 maybe mention be a little euphemized? Like, I don't know, Rahab, she was the best hostess in Jericho. Or Rahab, oh, she's the pretty working girl. Or maybe Rahab, the escort to the stars. I mean, something, right? It's bad enough that the name Rahab sounds an awful lot like rehab. So, like disguise it, right? Veil it. Put a little concealer on this little biblical blemish and just drop the reference to the brothel, wouldn't you? But the Bible doesn't do that. Just the opposite, actually. It points a hot red light right on Rahab. In fact, it's even attached to her name in the book of Hebrews Hall of Fame. It's in chapter 11. It mentions all these great, great people who have preceded us, who are now in heaven. Names like Abel, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. And then all of a sudden, the harlot Rahab. Chapter 11, verse 31. I mean, there's no asterisk by it. There's no footnote. There's no apology. Her story of harlotry is part of her testimony. And her story begins like this. And it was told the king of Jericho, saying, Behold, men have come here tonight from the children of Israel to search out the country. So the king of Jericho sent orders to Rahab. You see, the king of the Canaanites could see this massing of people on his horizon. And as I conjectured for you, we don't know specifically how many Hebrews there were, but given what we knew from Chronicles and how they had chronicled the number of people from each tribe who were men 18 years and older, we estimated that if some of those men were married and had children, we're talking about something along the lines of 2 million people who are leaving Egypt and coming into the Promised Land. So this isn't a Boy Scout troop. This is a huge mass of people. And the king sees this building on the horizon. And as Rahab would later disclose, apparently the people in Jericho were actually pretty terrified by what they were seeing. Word on the street was that God had his hand on these newcomers coming into town, and woe to anyone who got in their way. So when the king heard that the spies were hanging out at Rahab's place, he sent soldiers to fetch them. So, you know me, I like to take Old Testament history and kind of add to it my sometimes twisted or fertile imagination, but I'm kind of seeing at this point in time a dozen or so men squeezing down this narrow cobblestoned path in the red light district of Jericho. And it's probably late at night. And the torchlit taverns are probably still open. And the patrons who are there are probably just a few sheets to the wind. And as the king's men go by, the patrons are yelling obscenities to the troops, who promptly ignore them because they're focused on a mission. So the guards keep walking until they get to the wooden door of a stone building that abuts this famous Jericho wall. The lantern is unlit, leaving the soldiers perhaps to believe that nobody is there. Eventually, they hear this kind of shuffling coming from inside the door. And Rahab answers. And her makeup is layered. Her eyes are shadowed. Her low-cut robe reveals the fringe of a lacy secret that even Victoria's can't keep. Her voice is kind of husky from one cigarette too many. And she positions her hand on her hip as she's holding a martini in the other and says, "Sorry, boys, we're booked for the night." And you can just hear the captain say, "Honey, we aren't here for that. We're here for the Hebrews." Hebrews? She cocks her head. "I thought you were here for a good time," as she starts winking at the young soldier there at the end of the line. He blushes, but the captain stays focused on the mission. "We came for the spies. Where are they?" So I can just see her now. She steps out onto the porch. She looks left. She looks to the right. And then in this low, husky kind of voice, she says, "You just missed them. You just missed them. They snuck out the gates before they were shut. If you get a move on, maybe you can catch them." And at that, the king's men turn around and they run to go get the spies. Rahab now disappears around the corner, hurries up the brothel stairs to the roof where the two spies have been hiding. And she tells them, "Hey guys, the coast is clear. The whole city is talking about you and your armies. In fact, everyone is just freaking out. The king can't sleep and people can't eat. They're popping Xanax like they pop Tic Tacs. The last ounce of courage left on the train this morning. And her words, I'm thinking, probably would have stunned these spies. Remember, these are two guys that show up at a house of ill repute to scope out Jericho, where every single person there is a member of ISIS. And I'm thinking that they're kind of stunned by what she had to say. I mean, they never expected to find cowards in Jericho, right? And what's more, they never expected to find faith in a brothel. But they did. And I want you to read what Jericho's shady lady said to them. This is taken from Joshua chapter 2, verses 9 through 11. And I've kind of truncated it just to add some of the sentences together. I know that the Lord has given you the land. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea, and what you did to the other two kings who were on the other side of the Jordan. The Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. And I'm thinking, whoa, what do you know? Rahab found God. But probably better stated, it's God found Rahab. You see, he spotted a tender heart in this very hard city and reached out to save her. He would have saved the entire city, but no one asked. Then again, Rahab had an advantage over most of the people that she lived with there in Jericho. You see, church, she had nothing to lose. She was at the bottom of the rung culturally. She'd already lost her reputation decades ago. She had lost her social standing. She had lost her last chance for any kind of advancement. And I got to thinking, I don't know, have you ever been there? Have I ever been there? I mean, maybe we're still there. Now, we may not be selling our body like Rahab did, but maybe you've sold your allegiance, or you've sold your affection, or you've sold your attention, or you've sold your talents. You've sold out. And the truth is, we all have. And lest we think that God's promised land is promised to just a chosen few who levitate, he positions Rahab's story in the front of the book of Joshua. I mean, in fact, the narrator gives an entire chapter to Rahab. In fact, she gets more inches of type than do all of the priests and all of the spies and even Joshua's right-hand man combined. So if quantity and chronology mean anything theologically, then Rahab's headline position announces the following: God has a place for Rahabs in this world. And as evidence, I want you to consider Rahab's New Testament counterpart. She's referred to as the Samaritan woman. And in that story, by the time Jesus meets the Samaritan woman at a well, she was on a first-century version of a downward spiral. She had 5 ex-husbands, a half-dozen kids, and they all looked different because each had a different daddy. Decades of loose living had left her tattooed and tabooed and living with a boyfriend who thought that having a wedding was a waste of time. Gossipers wagged their tongues about her all the time, because how else do you explain her showing up in the middle of the day at the water well? I mean, other women went to that same well, filled their buckets early in the morning because it was cooler. But apparently, this Samaritan woman shows up at lunchtime at the well, apparently preferring the heat of the noonday sun over the heat of the women's scorn. And were it not for the appearance of a stranger, her story would likely have been lost in the Samaritan sands of time. But he entered her life with a promise of endless water and a quenched thirst. And you see, Jesus wasn't put off by her past, just the opposite, actually, because he offered to make music out of her garbage, and she accepted his offer. And we know that because of what happened next. In John chapter 4, verses 39 and 42, here's what the gospel writer says happened next with this Samaritan woman. Many Samaritans from the village believed in Jesus because the woman had said, "He told me everything I did." When they came out to see him, they begged him to stay in their village, so he stayed for 2 days, long enough for many more to hear his message and believe. Then they said to the woman, "Now we believe, not just because of what you told us, but because we have heard him ourselves. Now we know that he is indeed the Savior of the world." The woman on the margin became the woman with the message. If you look carefully in your Bibles, you will find that the first missionary that talks about Jesus Christ is a 5-time ex-divorcee with half a dozen kids from different daddies who nobody loves, and she's the one that is the messenger. She's the one that is the evangelist. She's the one that says, come and see the man who told me everything about my life. She is the first missionary, the Samaritan woman, the one that everybody else scorned. You see, Jesus gave her the chance of a lifetime. And he came for people just like her. And church, he came for people just like you and me. And that's the work of God, right? And what a work he did in the life of Rahab. The Hebrew spies, as it turns out, they were actually missionaries. They thought they were on a reconnaissance trip. That's what Joshua told them to do. But they weren't. I mean, do you think God really needed a scouting report on Jericho? I don't think so. His plan was to collapse the city walls, scout Jericho, and tell God what it was like. He didn't send the men out to collect data. He sent the spies to reach Rahab. And they told her, in Joshua chapter 2, verse 18, bind this line of scarlet cord in the window so that they could identify, obviously, her house when the Hebrews attacked. So I'm imagining, without any hesitation whatsoever, she bound the scarlet cord, maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe a dozen together, and she puts them in the window. And the spies escape, and Rahab is now keeping an eye out for the oncoming army. And she checked that cord to make sure it was tied securely and dangling from the window. And if my guess is right, I think she probably checked that cord 1,000 times. Because if there was no cord, her life was over. And when the Hebrews came and the walls fell, and when everyone else perished, Rahab and her family were saved. And Hebrews 11:31 says, by faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish. You see, church, her profession of faith mattered more than her profession as a harlot. And I'm thinking, I don't know each of your lives intimately. I mean, we can all put up a facade, right? And not anybody really knows who we are deep down inside. So I don't know, but maybe you have as checkered a past as Rahab. Maybe your peers don't share in your faith. Maybe your pedigree is one of violence, not peace. Maybe your ancestry is one of rebellion instead of grace. If so, then good news, Rahab is your model. We don't drop scarlet cords from the windows of our lives, do we? But we do trust the crimson thread of Christ's blood to save us. And we don't prepare for the coming of the Hebrews, but we do live with an eye toward the second coming of our Yeshua, Joshua. That would be Jesus Christ. Ultimately, we will all see what the people of Asunción, Paraguay are discovering today, that our mess of a life will become music, and God will have a heaven full of rescued Rahabs in his symphony orchestra. And whatever instrument, church, you're going to be playing, I'm pretty certain that we'll all know Amazing Grace by heart. All 5 verses, you're right. Or 6. You see, Jesus is greater still. And I don't care if your life is a wreck. I don't care if your life is perfect. Jesus cares about you as a child and wants you to live with him forever. And God loved you so much that he sent Jesus to die in your place, to accept the punishment that should have been yours and mine, so that we might have the reward that only God could give, and that's eternal life. And so, church, I want you to understand that it's okay to have a checkered past. It's okay to maybe be like a Rahab or a Samaritan woman. It's okay to be a thug like Paul was before he was called Paul. And it's okay to deny Jesus Christ at least the one time, like Peter did, actually denied Christ after the cock had crowed 3 times. But ultimately, remember, Jesus came back and said, Peter, do you love me? And Peter said, yes, Lord, you know I love you. Then feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I just told you that. I really love you. Okay. Then go feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I don't know how to say it. I love you. Good. Then feed my sheep. And church, we have lives that are full of mistakes. But do you love Jesus? Because if you do, you need to believe in his word. You need to do as he asks. And then you need to go out and share with others the good news that Jesus can provide for a world around us that is hurting. Jesus Christ is the answer. And it's going to be the best kept secret unless you and I tell others about him. Am I expecting each of you to be a street corner evangelist? Absolutely not. I'm not an evangelist. You know that. My day job is I'm a lawyer. I just do this because I get paid to talk. So the eldership just thought, well, you got the gift of gab. You can go up there and preach. Okay, so I do. But I have my day job. So I don't make it a point in court to say, oh, Your Honor, do you know Jesus Christ? Probably wouldn't go over very well for my client. And unfortunately, they've even taken the Bibles out of the courtroom. So how do you affect a culture that is doing everything it can to exclude Jesus Christ? You talk as you can, and you live your life as you should. And if you will do that, then that's probably the strongest and most poignant message your contacts will ever hear. And you don't know. It might be like a seed that you planted, and it may not bear fruit until years down the road. We don't know. But that notwithstanding, it's for you to go out and share the good news of Jesus Christ, either in action, in deed, or in word. Because if God can save riffraff like me, he can certainly do the same with the people that we come into contact with every day. So as I mentioned to you earlier, there's this prayer request. And if you have anything that you would like this church to be mindful of in prayer, you can pass it up, and we will do that, and then we'll close our services. But before we do that, we're going to sing "To Canaan's Land, I'm on my way." Steve, let's sing.